Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and with Boris Johnson beset from all sides over his failure to see his own COVID roadmap successfully concluded on time, something that was absolutely feasible and in fact expected in all quarters. He was caught LBW by Starmer multiple times in Parliament yesterday over his mishandling of the Indian Delta variant. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So at the start, I will just point out there's a couple of important anniversaries. Boris Johnson did mark the 5th anniversary of Joe Cox's death, the MP who was murdered by a far-right fascist, whose death he famously used to threaten MPs obstructing his Brexit. Quite frankly, I find it galling to ever hear this ape mentioning her name. But that being said, it is better that he spoke out against what happened than to have said nothing, even though he didn't mean a word of it. Starmer also reminded the House when he got to speak that it was 4 years since Grenfell and that hundreds of blocks still had Grenfell cladding. But the main topics of the day were the pandemic mishandling and Dominic Cummings releasing some WhatsApp messages. Ian Blackford brought up the messages, which were entertaining at least and revealing in some ways, but I want to talk about that separately. So I think in the next video, I'll go over Blackford's particular, well, his questions weren't entirely focused on that, but the bits that were later today, I'll focus on Starmer in this one. I did have a little message saying, can I go back to just doing the blow by blow thing of PMQs? I sort of try and do it in whatever way seems best on the particular time. I am going to go through most of what was said back and forth in this one, although not necessarily in the order, not necessarily in chronological order, more in the order of importance, I think. So Starmer did start off by focusing on the incompetence of our handling of the Delta variant, and he had Johnson beaten multiple times and forced to do little more than flap about. There are times when Johnson goes in and he's got his lies ready and he's got his pre-prepared lines ready. He knows what's coming and he just goes with them. And there are other times when he just knows he's done all ends up, particularly when he can feel the pressure from his own backbenchers. Starmer initially prodded at the failure to complete the roadmap on time. Again, Starmer knows that a lot of Conservative MPs are outraged about this. And he asked if Johnson accepts that his failure to put India on the red list sooner contributed to the spread of the Delta variant. Now, Johnson, at this point, he actually did think he had answers. You know, he said it wasn't considered to be a concern until after the red list decision was taken, which is not quite right for a couple of reasons, actually. One, it was actually identified as a variant of concern a couple of days before the government put India on the red list. But that's just in this country. It was a variant of concern as far back as March internationally. You can find reports, even in the British media, highlighting concerns before India was added to the red list on April the 23rd. And there was even a piece on the BBC News from 25th of March, which highlighted the concerns that the variants, and there were more than one emerging from India, could be both more transmissible and less affected by the vaccines we were using. You know, it's such an easy thing to fact check if you thought your memory might be a bit faulty, and it's always a good thing to do that. And the second thing I'd pick on is it is more splitting hairs. You can't say you identified it as a concern after you put travel restrictions in place, because that's what he said. So he is trying to say that the chronology is now, India was added to the red list, then they realised that there was a reason to put it on the red list. Why would you put India on the red list before it was a concern? You wouldn't. But that's less important than the fact that there were reports nationally and internationally of worrying variants emerging from India. Johnson tried to say that the Delta variant wasn't even identified before then, because Starmer was saying, look, the government knew about this on April the 1st, which is true. Johnson was trying to say that what Starmer was referring to, you mean the Kappa variant. Stop going on about the Delta variant. You mean the Kappa variant. Now, it is true there are multiple variants. The Kappa variant is not a variant of concern. It is being investigated. There were a number of variants emerging in India in February and March that were coming to attention. But it is not true to say that the Delta was identified In fact, it wouldn't have even been identified after the kappa. That wouldn't make sense. Kappa comes well after delta in the alphabet. And I doubt the names are just being randomly applied. Usually the way these things, in any scientific context, it goes in order of something. You would think chronological order in this case. But experts have certainly been talking specifically about the Delta variant, which if you want to look it up in other contexts is the B16172 variant, for weeks before we took any action. We know that the government knew of it on April the 1st. Tell you who else knew of it on April the 1st? Anyone who was reading what the experts were saying about it. So it is an objectively false statement to say that the variant hadn't been identified until later. It was identified weeks before we put India on the red list. It was identified by the UK government on April the 1st. Now the Kappa variant may also have been added to the list by our government on the same day, but they definitely knew about Delta. That specific variant. There it is again, B16172. Now, he tried to say that it wasn't identified as a variant of concern. Now, at this point, sort of yes and no. See, like I said, there are variants under investigation and variants of concern. That's how they're sort of divided. It is true that the Delta was allocated as a variant of concern on April the 21st. But two things about that. One, that, like I said before, that's 2 days before we added India to the red list still. And second, that was the UK government's designation. He might be there. If you were just watching that, you might think, oh, that's when the world became concerned. No, that's when the UK government decided to give it that designation. It was of serious concern internationally before then. This is Boris Johnson marking his own homework. He's had for weeks Labour saying to him, will you sort out some travel restrictions from India to the UK? And Johnson going, no, it's not a concern. He's deciding it's not a concern. He's referring to the official designation given by the government he is in charge of, not the international expert views. I'm going to put a link, actually, as long as I remember, I hope I remember, to a 5-minute video from Led by Donkeys from Twitter below as well. You can watch that and try and tell me we were caught by surprise by this thing. Besides, the other thing to bear in mind is we don't need to get into arguments about different variants. We don't need to get into an argument about, oh, were we worried about one particular variant and then it turns out we got another one and we didn't actually know about this one at the time. The fact is India was experiencing explosive growth in COVID cases. That was enough to tell you that at least one of their new variants was likely to be much more transmissible. We don't need to know that it definitely is. Just the likelihood, never mind anything else, that alone was enough to restrict travel from India to the UK. Just the numbers. Never mind what's causing it. Just the numbers alone are enough to go, we need to be a bit careful here. Starmer also reminded Johnson that he had repeatedly called for us to take tougher actions on the border. Now here's a point of interest. Johnson keeps trying to call Starmer Captain Hindsight. Whenever he points out something that he pointed out months ago, oh yes, just hindsight. You're Captain Hindsight. But if Starmer was calling for tougher actions specifically against this variant before we applied it, as he is recorded as doing, then if Johnson says that he only realised it was a problem on April the 21st or April the 23rd, take your pick, isn't Boris Johnson basically saying that Keir Starmer had better foresight than him? Because that is certainly what I'd have responded with. Hey, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, seems to be suggesting I was calling for action against the Delta variant from early April. But the Prime Minister has just said he didn't even know what it was until late April. Doesn't that mean that I have more foresight than the Prime Minister? Foresight of several weeks ahead, in fact. Or is the Prime Minister going to change his mind and say that he did know about it earlier after all? Trap him in his own bollocks. That being said, Starmer did come back with something pretty good. He compared the Delta variant rates with other countries around the world and pointed out, well, hang on a minute, if the Delta variant rate comes from all the way over India, if it's higher here than elsewhere and our border policy is strong, why is that exactly? To which, this is the point where Johnson, unsurprisingly, just didn't have an answer. Because how do you have an answer? Even given that he's a master of bluster, how do you have an answer to that? You're saying our border controls are really tight. The Delta variant, which comes from the other side of the world, is really high in this country, but it's not in lots of other countries between us. How is that then? Explain that. Didn't have an answer. pulled one of his tricks and tried to turn it on Labour, saying Labour were calling for the entire country to be shut down. This is what a child says, isn't it? Oh, you're calling for us to shut the entire country down. No, we're asking you to put restrictions in place on people travelling from India, either directly or indirectly, to the UK. That's not shutting the entire country down. Boris Johnson said 75% of our medicines and 50% of our food comes from abroad. Actually, almost all of both comes specifically from Europe, Prime Minister. Might want to remember that with this EU trade war you're threatening. But of course, Keir Starmer did not say that. He's steering well clear of Brexit still, as far as I can tell. But the point is that almost no food or medicines come from India to the UK. Some do, almost none. And what medicines and food do come from India don't travel to us via business class. So another pointless distraction from the fact he was trapped again. And Starmer was right on this. You know, he started off by saying that as things get worse, Johnson gets more pathetic. He also asked Boris Johnson if he really thought that the 20,000 people who came in from India while he was messing about delaying this red list, if he thought those 20,000 people travelling from India were bringing in vital medical supplies or food. Again, what did Johnson do? Flapped away. Starmer also reminded us of a few things the Prime Minister had said in the past about the pandemic. We're going to turn the tide in 12 weeks. That was the first lockdown. It will all be over by Christmas. June the 21st will be Freedom Day. And then on to the crux of how Starmer aims to eventually beat Johnson, or how he hopes to. He said that the British people don't expect miracles, but they do expect basic competence and honesty. Unfortunately, I have to say, I'm not sure that's the case. If it were, I don't see how Boris Johnson could still be Prime Minister. Hard to imagine how he'd ever have become Prime Minister. All Johnson had left was his Brexit rhetoric, however, in response. He said our vaccine rollout would have been impossible if we'd stayed in the European Medicines Agency, as Starmer had wanted. And he keeps using this a lot, and I really wish Starmer would take it on. I wish he would take it on, but he just ignores it. I wouldn't. I would point out that we were in the European Medicines Agency when our vaccination programme started. I would point out that we are still, although we're not in the agency, we are still following the same regulations for 2 years, signed up to that. So there's no material difference between us being in it and out of it at the moment. And we were in it when our vaccine rollout started and was going well. I might even list a few of the EU countries that are still in the European Medicines Agencies that now have higher rates of vaccine rollout than we do, and ask the Prime Minister why he allowed the NHS's great progress slip with cack-handed political interference from a health secretary that Dominic Cummings' newly released messages show Boris Johnson as describing as totally effing hopeless. But I'll be getting onto those little tidbits from Cummings next, I hope. Until then, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.